Well, the problem of how to manage conflicts is not just a challenge for today, it's also a challenge for the future. Because we really want to prepare our children to have better lives than ours. That's every parent's wish. So we need to talk about here in this lecture with how to teach our children about conflict. We know a lot about conflict that our parents didn't know. So we have an advantage there. And our challenge is to pass this knowledge on to our children, to help them build skill for using it so that they can do better with it than we do. And that's our subject in this lecture. What we want to do here is look at what our children are learning about conflict and how it's managed, where they're learning it, what we're learning about how to teach children and what we're learning about what they're learning. And we want to look at ways to improve what they're learning. We're going to conclude that there's good reason to hope that our children really do have a better shot at managing conflict than we do, just as we had a better shot than our parents had. So let's get started. What do our children learn about conflict now, and where do they learn it? You know, what they learn is a very mixed set of lessons about managing conflict. Some of those are helpful, and some of them are not so helpful, and some are genuinely harmful. That learning begins and continues at home, just like ours did, at least when they're toddlers, if not before. But then it continues in their neighborhoods, it continues at school, and it's ongoing in the media as all of that takes place. So how do they learn? Let's start at home with how we teach our children there. The way children learn mostly at home from their parents is by watching us and watching their siblings, especially if they have older siblings, watching how we handle conflict and deal with it, and then they try things out for themselves. From the actions and words of parents, children gain a great deal, and they get hurt a great deal when those don't work. They really learn what they regard as normal behavior from us, watching us. We do so much more teaching of our children when we're not intending to teach them than when we're actually intending to teach them. And one of the ways we do that is whenever we handle a conflict poorly and the children know about it, that's painful and it's frightening for them, and they draw lessons from it. And those lessons can be detrimental over the long run, if we get detrimental over their lives. We teach them about love and how that works. We teach them about relationships by relating. And we also teach them about who they are and how they're valued when we deal with conflict, including when we deal with conflict with them. We know some things about this. For instance, we know that to a child, any comment about one parent by the other parent, either negative or positive, is also taken as a judgment about that parent, but the child takes it in also as a judgment about him or her. And so criticism of the other parent can go right to the child's heart. So when we're being negative and not handling a conflict well, we're hurting the child, and the child is learning something that we didn't want them to pick up. We know from research that children in high conflict families, where conflict is going on and it's not being handled well so that it's oppositional and hostile, those children certainly have greater problems with psychological adjustment, with their conduct, and with their self-concept. And the evidence suggests that the way parents communicate during a conflict, not whether they have a conflict, but the way they communicate, the way they interact with each other in a conflict, that's the thing that's going to affect the child's well-being most, and that's what's going to give the child the lessons for how to deal with their own conflicts as they move along. So how can we teach them? How can we do a better job of teaching them? One is, we know we have to model good conflict management for our children. That can be awfully difficult. I don't like being on the spot where I've got to handle my conflicts well, not just for me, but if the kids are watching what's going on, it's going to have an effect in their lives. That's an enormous load for a parent to carry, but it's our load as a parent. Anybody who's a parent knows we're in over our heads, but we have to do our best. So what I want to do is model the best conflict management I can do. That doesn't mean we ought to do avoidance of conflict or to try to guarantee that no conflict occurs. If we're avoiding, resolution's not going to occur, and what the children will pick up is the resentment that breeds. And they'll see things that don't really make sense to them. They need to see good conflict management in place, not conflict avoidance. When there's strife in the parents' relationship, children really tune into that. They observe us much more closely when that's going on. So when it's strife and it's ugly, minimize their exposure to ongoing strife. If things are going to be handled, they need to be gotten on the table. You don't put it all in front of the kids, but you don't hide it from them, and you don't want an ongoing struggle taking place that the kids are watching and worrying about. This is especially important in what happens when parents separate or divorce. Getting kids through that is extremely difficult, and they're watching us more closely then, so they're picking up lessons and they're being more strongly imprinted. So you don't want to unnecessarily expose them to the ugly side of the conflict that happens that way. Even in those difficult times, we've got to pay attention to modeling civility for the kids. We've got to try to handle the conflicts constructively and get through that and move toward the kind of good goodbye that I was talking about in the aftermath lecture last time. We want to help the children cope with this ongoing conflict as it takes place. You know, if you think about it, that conflict that's occurring, if it's going to a divorce or a separation, that's the ultimate for children in that critical communication context that we talked about when we talked about close personal relationships a while ago. So we really have to do a lot more communicating and get the kids through that. What else can we do? It's not just modeling. What else is there? There's direct instruction. You know, we can teach children consciously describing and explaining how to manage conflict and about the consequences of good conflict management and bad conflict management. And that kind of verbal instruction requires a lot of repetition. One of the things we know in communication research is that repetition is not a bad thing. Repetition is a necessary thing for any of us to get it. We need redundancy of messages for them to stick, especially when we're trying to teach kids. So we need to explain a lot. We need to do it repeatedly. We need to watch for teachable moments when we have an opportunity to explain and take advantage of those. We also need to ensure that when the kids do good conflict management strategies, they at least get some positive feedback for that. And you know, they will get their share of good results, but with no guarantees. You don't always get good results when you do a good job, but you get your share of good results. You know, we also want to avoid paying off poor conflict management strategies. There should be no payoffs for kids for bad behavior, and they do that. You know, when I think about this, I think a lot of times in work situations and that we can go to work and sometimes we can identify the person in the workplace who learned as a toddler that behavior of temper tantrums is going to work. Tried that with a parent and it worked, and you know, that little kid learned to do temper tantrums and got skilled at it, and some of those people are our work colleagues today, still using temper tantrums to get what they want. So don't pay off bad conflict management behavior. Try to make the good conflict management behavior pay off. It's also true in the family in terms of teaching kids that you want the family power and interaction struggle to include power for everybody. Now, children surely don't have equal power with parents, but they've got to have influence. They shouldn't be powerless people, because that traps them into that thing where they're not responsible for anything. In families where power feels shared, where all members feel like they at least have some influence and they count in that sense, conflicts are going to be handled better. So we want that to happen for our children in conflicts. If the conflict's between us and the children, the parent-child conflicts, we need to listen and negotiate when that's appropriate and possible, but then exercise parental authority when it's needed. These things are so easy for me to stand here and say, and in the heat of the moment with a kid who's been acting out in some way, they can be very difficult. But that's what we need to try to do as a parent. Useful tool for doing this is practicing and teaching the kids to practice the perspective taking that we talked about way back in lecture 4, and using those regular family meetings that we recommended in lecture 15. Those elements, especially those family meetings, can be used to give children a voice, but in an appropriate amount, and to let them speak their turn, have their say, and be heard. Those things really help children learn. We can teach them at home, we can teach them in the family how to better resolve conflicts. What exactly should we teach them? These are the lessons that they really ought to get about managing conflict. And they're the same things we talked about in the lectures throughout this course. 1, we need to teach them to express feelings and talk about how they feel using I statements, not acting out, and not using you statements, the accusations of the other party. We can teach children to phrase things that way, and this is much easier to learn early if you're a child than it is to learn for us as adults. Secondly, we can teach them to listen to the other person and to try not to judge the other person when they're doing it. As kids, we want to easily snap to judgments, and we can help them refrain from doing that. Thirdly, we can teach them to consider the other person's point of view and feelings as they move forward. It's an important thing to remind them and to teach them, and we can do this talking to them and working with them when they're in conflict. Fourth, we want to teach them to take responsibility for their own part in a conflict, their own behavior, and to apologize when it's important. It's not just tell Johnny you're sorry, but help them learn those 5 steps of an apology that we talked about, and teach them to take responsibility for their own behavior. Fifth, we can teach them to invite the other person in a conflict to work together with them to resolve a conflict. Kids can learn early the principle of win-win because it's real, and they can experience win-win resolutions and carry that into their adult life. Sixth, we need to teach them to work with their emotions, to manage those emotions. I don't mean to teach them to turn emotions off or turn emotions on, because we can't really do that as adults, and kids certainly can't. But we can teach them not to behave in ways where they're acting out on negative emotions. We can teach them to take a time out and calm down and not focus on the thing that they're saying. We can teach them to manage their behavior when they're having emotions so that they can report those emotions appropriately and get on with working through the conflict. Seventh, we can teach them not to hold grudges, to move toward healing and getting past things. We can teach kids that. We can talk to them about it. We can show them, and we can suggest ways that they can do it. And eighth, we can teach them to practice these skills. We can work with them to practice these skills in conflicts with us as we move along. So we've got a lot of teaching that we can do. We have great opportunities as parents to work with our kids and teach them directly about managing conflict. Okay, that's managing conflict in the home. What about what they learn from managing conflict? What about their learning outside the home? Because we don't get to keep them under our care all the time. Children learn an awful lot about how they're going to manage conflict outside the home. And we can think of this as beginning in the neighborhood. The lessons that happen on the street and with kids when they're playing in the yard. And a lot of these lessons can contradict what they learned at home, and they can be more potent. You know, when I think of this, I always go back to an event that happened in my life when I think I was 7. I might have been only 6. It was the point where I was beginning to go out and play beyond the yard and move up and down the street on the block where we lived. And when I got out there beyond our own front porch, a thing that happened on several occasions would be that I would get out there and this one other boy in the neighborhood would come bounding out from behind a bush or a tree and come running up, and he would hit me, knock me down, and actually stomped on me. It was pretty ugly. And I, who was a skinny little kid, in terror would jump up and run home screaming and run in the house crying. This happened several times. My mother was very upset by this, and she immediately went down the street to the boy's house and complained to his mother, which in turn got him in trouble, so the next time I went out, he hit me even harder. But this wasn't working out well for little Michael. Intervening on this was my dad and our next door neighbor, a wonderful guy, Mr. Benson, our neighbor. They decided that little Michael needs to learn to defend himself, these two men did. So they went out and got 2 pairs of boxing gloves, and my dad got down on his knees with me in the living room, and he taught me how to block a punch and how to throw a punch straight from the shoulder. And he explained to me carefully, you never attack another person without being attacked, but this is how you defend yourself if the other person attacks you. Block a punch, throw a punch. And we practiced in the living room. And then when they thought that I'd learned this lesson, we took the gloves off and I went out the front door and went out to play. And sure enough, that fellow from down the street came up from behind the bush, came running up and went to take a swing at me. And just as I was taught, blocked that punch, threw a punch straight into his face, right into his nose, which obligingly began to bleed profusely. He burst into tears and ran home crying. My dad and Mr. Benton had seen this through the living room window. They came out onto the front porch and cheered, and I got a ride on my dad's shoulders up the street to the neighborhood drugstore, and I had the first chocolate milkshake I'd ever had in my life, and it was the most wonderful thing I'd ever tasted. Marvelous lesson in conflict management. Now notice, my dad was teaching me in the house how to do this right, careful instruction, but I learned some things on the street. I didn't just learn how to block a punch and throw a punch when I was attacked. I had also learned that ambush and terrifying the other person is a really potent and powerful thing to do. And you know what? I became a bit of a neighborhood bully after that, and I ambushed a few people myself. So which lessons did I learn? In part, I learned them both. But the parent doesn't have full control of what the child is learning. We learn things on the street. And then we go test our learnings themselves, and we experiment with independence. You know, most research on how young people handle conflict has really been focused on whether they're going to learn violence, especially whether they're going to gang violence. That's where so much research has been done. But there's also research that's broader. Calvin Morrow, a sociologist at UC Berkeley, and some of his colleagues have been taking a much wider view, much wider contextual view of this. And they've been looking at how young people really learn to apply strategies for conflict and how they handle conflict in general. And what they're finding is these kids, as they move up through adolescence, are applying roughly the same set of conflict management strategies that their parents are applying. And they're finding that this is a developmental process, that the kids tend to get more rational and more attuned to moral questions as they do that, what's the right thing to do as they move along, and they get less impulsive as they progress through adolescence. That's pretty good news in terms of how people handle conflicts in general. So how do we want to deal with this as parents? We're going to want to avoid being either overprotective or underprotective. The kids have to get out there in the world and learn and develop as they go along. But we have a lot of teaching still to do. They're going to have to learn to take some risks and solve some problems on their own. That's really an essential part of their development. One of the things we have as a term at universities these days is pretty widespread is we talk about what we call helicopter parents. And the helicopter parents it's as if the parent were hovering in a helicopter over the kid as it moved through campus into our classes, ready to descend and rescue the kid whenever the kid gets into a problem. And in this age where the kids can talk to their parents on cell phones day in and day out as they move about the campus, that's a strong temptation. The kids are going to need to feel all the way up through college level and into adulthood, they're going to need to feel that they can rely on their parents for support and backup. But they don't want to be jumping to mom and dad help me as soon as they get into a conflict. So parents do need to, and they usually do know what their children are encountering, but not in detail. They need to be able to help them process what happens, but we don't want them to jump in and just resolve every conflict for the kids. They got to learn some conflict management themselves. So that's when they hit the street and when they go from there. What about learning conflict management like at school? Schools are interesting places for learning this these days. Kids, of course, get modeling from their teachers and their peers at school, and the same things they learn in the neighborhood, they learn on playgrounds and in the halls. Those lessons are continuing. They're continuing to learn from peers the same way they would there. But at school, these lessons and influences seem to be significantly magnified. What does happen at school is teachers serve as models. Children observe how they handle it and observe how teachers deal with each other and with the staff. But beyond that, there's direct instruction that takes place at schools these days. It's uneven. Some schools have excellent programs, some have none at all. It's uneven. But many schools these days do some very good instruction of children in terms of conflict management. One of the best things for doing this, one of the best programs for doing this, is called peer mediation. There are peer mediation programs in many schools in the United States and in Canada. In these programs, what happens is the students are invited to volunteer, they learn about it, and they're invited to volunteer. And then the students that volunteer receive instruction in how to help others resolve conflicts. It's the helping others material that I gave you in that lecture. They learn those things and only taught at a children's level in grade schools and some in high schools. These programs have an excellent track record. Then what happens is when other kids in the school have a conflict going, they have the opportunity to have a peer mediator. One of these children has been trained. And they have an excellent track record helping each other work through conflicts. And in that process, all the kids learn to better manage conflict. So these things work very, very well. There are other structured programs that are called peace circles, and there are programs at schools these days for managing bully behavior on the playgrounds, a whole lot of different programs, but I'm very impressed with those peer mediation programs that take place. There's actually a section of the Association for Conflict Resolution called the Education section, which is actively supporting development of those programs. So at all kinds of schools, colleges very often have these. Many colleges and universities, we have courses in conflict management these days that the kids can take. And I'm always delighted to teach a course of that. I do at least one a year. The NCAA actually also has a program called Step Up that works with athletes. It's not directly a conflict management program, but it has a lot of training in it that focuses on how to help others manage conflicts. Because young athletes are looked up to, and they're often looked to step in when an altercation occurs. A very good program supported by the NCAA that's on many campuses throughout the United States these days. So lots of help in schools is taking place. We need also to talk a bit about television and video and film. Children just don't learn at home, in the neighborhood, and at school. They get a lot of that through the media. It can be frightening how many hours children spend looking at a screen on any given day. The average appears to be somewhere between 3 and 4 hours a day, and that can pose a difficult challenge. One of the things that's been looked at a lot is violence in television and film, and what's the effect of that, and does it incite kids, does it cause them to get more violent? One of the things we can take heart from that's emerging from the research on this is that the vast majority of kids do not respond to those things by becoming more violent. However, that same research shows us that a significant number of kids, it's a minority, but it's a significant number, and it includes girls just about equally as boys, will be induced to become more aggressive and some violent as a function of the violence they see in film and on television. Moreover, in the research on video games, normal kids, they don't affect as much, but that minority, those video games have an even greater effect on them. So there's learning about how to handle conflict in the violence realm that's a little bit frightening. So those children are more susceptible. Well, the leading researchers on this argue that this evidence is very, very strong. There are some others that argue that it's not all that conclusive, but it certainly leans in that direction. Well, can we predict which kids are going to be the ones that are more susceptible to those really harmful influences? Not exactly very well. That's still a little murky. But it is very clear that kids who grow up in a family where the family itself, that environment includes violence, or who associate with peers who are violent, will hook more into the violence they encounter in the media, especially those video games, and they're going to be more effective. So that's the danger area to look at. Well, researchers are learning all of that, but that's focused on violence. Researchers are also learning more about how the narratives in entertainment influence children. And that's an important area we ought to think about, because it's wider than just the question of whether a kid's going to become violent or not. This research may be able to inform various policies on media and parents in terms of what they expose kids to. The broader significance here is the narratives about how issues are dealt with in the various fictional episodes that occur, television, film especially. What are kids seeing here, and how does that affect them? Children learn about life and they act out some vicariously, and that includes their interaction with the media that they're so exposed to. What they're constantly hearing are lessons through narrative stories that reinforce lessons that they learn and intend to. So early in life, what do they listen to in media? This could be fairy tales and books read to them by their parents. Easy to get the good positive lessons in those. But early on, those children are exposed to lots of television, videos, and movies. And it's not just the violence or not violence. These narratives engage kids' imagination, and every story involves the kind of situation where you have a main character who encounters some sort of an obstacle, something in the way, some sort of a conflict, and the narrative moves on how that main character chooses to deal with that and what works out, how that works out, how it gets to a good conclusion. It's very seldom in those narratives that what happens is the main character decides to pursue a win-win resolution and negotiates that and it works out. You know why? That's really what we want to do, but it's kind of boring TV and movies. So the narratives don't go that way. There's more clash. And and there are devious means, and there's manipulation, and there are all kinds of other things that happen. And that's what the kids see and take in as lessons. And then when they see how that works out, they're exposed to that, and they draw conclusions from that. So we really want to look at what the kids are learning. We want to reduce, although we shouldn't even try to eliminate that those things where conflict isn't resolved in a positive way. But we want to try to watch what the kids are watching and move it in a direction so they at least see some things where the conflict management strategy is more constructive. It's nice to watch shows along with the kids when we can and talk with the kids about how conflict is handled. And when it wasn't handled in a good way, talk about that. We want to try to expose our children to good stories, exciting stories if possible, in which conflict is handled in a constructive way and resolved with some kind of goodwill and negotiation. You know, there's a list of these, a beginning list at least in the guidebook that you can turn to for this course. All right, that's teaching children about conflict. Let's move to a summary. Whether and how much conflict management will improve in the future depends a whole lot on what we teach our children about managing conflict. And whether it improves in their individual lives depends a whole lot on what we teach them. And that's really going to affect the quality of their lives as they move through it. So, if you're parents, what I hope you'll most take from this lecture is that there are basic actions and steps that we can take in terms of teaching our children about conflict. First one is this. We really need to be careful to model the interaction in general and the conflict management behaviors that we want our children to learn. And that's especially hard to do, given that it may not be what we learned as little kids. We're trying to overcome our early learning and pass the better way on to our kids by modeling. An enormous challenge, but we can do it. And the better we do it, the better lessons the kids will learn. Second thing is, we need to spend some time teaching our kids about good conflict management skills. We need to teach them to express their feelings in terms of how they feel with I statements, not accusations, you statements about the other person. We need to teach them to listen to the other person without judging, to consider the other person's point of view and the other person's feelings. We need to teach them to take responsibility for their part in conflict and apologize when it's appropriate. Hard to do, but we need to do it. We need to teach them to invite the other person to work together with them for a win-win resolution. And if we can get them to do that and have some success, that'll be a lesson they'll hold on to and continue. We need to teach them to manage their emotions by not acting out and rather expressing them appropriately by talking about them as I statements. And teach them too not to hold grudges. Those are all lessons we should teach our children. Third thing we ought to do is make sure they get positive feedback at home when they handle conflict well. We need to honor that. Fourth thing is we need to pay attention to what they're learning about conflict in the neighborhood and school and try to help them understand those lessons and discriminate. We can work with them on that. Fifth, we need to monitor what the kids read and what they see on TV. We can't do a perfect job of this, but we've got to look and try to get some of it to be positive. Sixth, we can also work with the children's school to establish some conflict management programs. Those peer mediation programs could be in a lot more places than they are. This is a pretty daunting challenge, I know, that I'm asking you to do. But we really do have the opportunity because we know more about conflict management than our parents do. And if we pass these gains along with the kids, they're going to have a better future. They're going to have a better life. And you know what? They may learn more than we were able to teach them and pass those lessons beyond onto their kids. So this is really about the future. We've got a job teaching our kids. That's the future of conflict management. I got an assignment for you. Especially if you're a parent. Ask yourself what you learned about conflict from your family when you were little. Try to consider how early you learned that and how those lessons have affected your life and your conflict management as you've gone along. Then I want you to consider how you can demonstrate more constructive conflict management to the children. Try to come up with some specific things you can do and act on those and do them. And then how you can manage to help them manage conflict more constructively. That's what I want you to do. Let's talk about what's going to happen in our final lecture. We've been through the whole thing from start to finish and ended up in this lecture with teaching our children in the future. What I want to do now in lecture 24 is to go back and kind of review the lessons we've learned. I want to compare what we knew back in 1950 and how things would have gone to to what we know now and how we can do it better and how we need to do it better now. I also want to end by focusing on what it is we still need to learn, what the challenge is going forward from here with conflict.